Today's meeting is dedicated to the European Union ahead of the European election 2019, the further development of cooperation between national parliaments and European institutions. And, ladies and gentlemen, permit me to make a few comments in connection with this subject. First of all, what is it that makes Europe? An essential part of the European identity is certainly the joint commitment to the rule of law, to the fundamental and human rights, and to parliamentary democracy. And we should not regard this core of our identity never as a matter of course, and we should never lose sight of it. And whoever shakes this basic understandings is actually putting into doubt the foundation of the European unification project. And especially ahead of the elections here to the European Parliament, this needs to be underlined. And secondly, I think that the growth of anti-Semitism in Europe, actually worldwide, is something that has reached a format where racism and xenophobia that have also appeared on a large extent. It is something that we have to condemn. Hatred of Jews is an expression of an anti-democratic attitude, as was stated by Deborah Lipstadt, the Holocaust researcher, and I would like to quote her. Jews are something like a thermometer of our society. Who attacks them attacks all democratic and multicultural values, unquote. And the Council in December 2018, for the first time, issued a declaration on the fight against anti-Semitism. It's important to note that in the conclusions of this conference here, we also find very clear words on this subject. And a third item. A central component and characteristic of Europe is that we are a modern secular state. And we cannot and must not admit that these achievements of the European Enlightenment are discredited by radical Islamic or other extremist forces and even destroyed. Unfortunately, it is one of the omissions of European policies in recent years and decades that there was no timely reaction to the creation of parallel societies, as was mentioned by Lega Kelly when she was awarded the Scholl Prize in 2005. So these parallel societies emerged, and we did not react to them in time. I can see that this is a major task for the Muslim religious leaders in raising their voices for a European Islam on the ground and on the basis of European values and the rule of law, and in this sense also have an impact and act on their communities. And the fourth component, the principle of subsidiarity. It is a core element of European integration. The Prime Minister of Schleswig-Holstein just told me, and we think that this is a understanding of the people of the subsidiarity principle. The subsidiarity principle is an expression of the sovereignty of national states and of their regional structures, and in preserving subsidiarity, parliaments have an important role to play. Member states should have more discretion and more scope of action when it comes to topics that affect the population directly. And for European legislation, this means we need more directives and fewer regulations. Taking subsidiarity seriously does not mean that we weaken the European Union. On the contrary, it strengthens the confidence of citizens in the Union if the small things are regulated on a close area, close level. At the same time, in the large issues such as the foreign policy or the security policy or the trade policy, we need more Europe in order to compete internationally. I look forward to the discussion that we will have. We have 4 keynote speakers. They each have 8 minutes time to speak, and then we will again have you and your statements of 4 minutes each. And first of all, I would like to give the floor to the President of the German Bundestag, Mr. Schäuble. Mr. President, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Sobotka. Dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to thank you, Mr. Sobotka, for the invitation to speak here at this very well-organized conference and for the wonderful evening which we enjoyed yesterday together at the Leopold Museum, including the marvelous Kokoschka exhibition. Thank you very much for that. Dear colleagues, it is said that 2019 is a watershed year for the European Union. And this is true to some extent. The EU faces many challenges this year. But a watershed, that would mean some inevitable development against which we are powerless. And this does not apply to Europe's current problems. We are entirely capable of overcoming these difficulties ourselves. There is no doubt that the European Union is undergoing a stress test, and not only as a result of Brexit and the endless history. But history has taught us, however, that European unity has always made substantial progress during or following times of great crisis, and this gives me grounds to be optimistic, despite of all the upheaval and the lack of unity in many areas of politics. And the growing acceptance within the population is also encouraging. According to the Eurobarometer, 62% of Europeans view their country's membership of the EU positively. More than two-thirds believe that their country benefits from membership. Approval ratings have not been this high since 1983. However, this is only one part of the reality. At the same time, citizens are nursing doubts about the European institutions' ability to solve problems and over the benefits of EU policy on their day-to-day lives. And such doubts have existed for a long time, and they're actually on the rise. The European Parliament and the Commission are still barely accepted by a majority of EU citizens as an independent, democratically elected representatives. And too often, grand promises have led to meager results that are, on top, perceived by many citizens to be inefficient. And sometimes they are. There is a lot of work ahead of us in this respect. And the national parliaments are one important channel of communication for strengthening Europeans' links to the EU institutions. They remain the first point of contact with these in the member states. It is not only the European Parliament, but also the national parliaments and legislative chambers, 41 in total, have gradually gained significance in European policy matters as a result of European treaties. However, there is of course always room for even greater improvement. The freedom of reform afforded by primary law is nevertheless limited, not least due to the principle of unanimity. And that is why we need to concentrate pragmatically on the most urgent tasks in order to win back trust in the European institutions. Central to this is improving our ability to take action. That is why a fundamental debate is required on what member states are able to decide for themselves and where joint action is necessary. The problems that Europe can only tackle as a community, the environment, border security, migration, banks, and the economy, do not only need to be defined, however, they need to be tackled, and they need to be tackled now and not in the distant future. Action is what our citizens expect. Member states are still the sole deciders on many key issues, and the willingness to share national sovereignty is not particularly great in many places. There is also occasionally a lack of willingness to trust in majority decisions taken at European level. National interests, specific cultural and historical legacies, different means of political decision-making and application of the law all play a key role. They limit our view, even ours as parliamentarians. If we wish to find shared solutions in Europe, it is essential that we not only tolerate these national characteristics, but also respect them. Above all, however, we need to be willing to always include other perspectives in our considerations and to discuss differences in order to better understand another point of view. In debates on European matters in the national parliaments, We are called upon to always adopt a genuinely European perspective alongside the national point of view with its narrower angle. And regular dialogue between the national parliaments in particular can contribute towards this, which is why formats such as this meeting have particular significance. In addition, the bilateral cooperation between the parliaments of Germany and France, which we have recently given a new foundation in the form of a joint parliamentary assembly of the Assemblée Nationale and the Bundestag, and this demonstrates what is impossible and what we want to learn from each other. Europe is an intricate, multicolored patchwork, as was described by the British historian Timothy Garton Ash. And those who recognize this will move Europe forwards. Nobody makes any progress nowadays by finger-wagging. We cannot reform anything in Europe if each member attempts to shape the other in their own image. If we wish to move forward in Europe, we need to overcome self-imposed national blockades. And to do so, each one of us will need to be prepared to examine their own positions and allow some flexibility. Improving cooperation, establishing the capacity for action, finding solutions, this does not mean reinventing the wheel. Pragmatic intergovernmental cooperation already exists. In areas where some do not wish to take part, those are willing to move forward will do so. As long as such processes remain fundamentally open to all, they can be constructive. We need to explain convincingly that there are areas of politics where cooperation represents the best path. I believe our common arms and defense policy is indispensable. Europe can and must do more in this respect. We need to take on more responsibility for our own security and also for the security of the surrounding regions, what we discussed yesterday. And with all due respect, what is happening in Libya right now is the opposition of what I actually expect and hope that would be the case for a common European foreign policy. And this just shows what has happened if we have no common defense policy. But let me get back. If we do it together, then we can achieve progress. The agreement on joint military projects within the framework of PESCO is therefore a step in the right direction, but this is just a big start. The islands of cooperation must be expanded in the coming years, and the accelerated integration of national armies developed further. If we succeed in convincingly translating the political areas in which cooperation is required into political action, we will have little room for nationalists, populists, and demagogues. Dear colleagues, I'm fully convinced that in this century, as Europeans, we only have one opportunity, namely if we tackle the central issues together and bring about solutions, take them to solutions, and as national parliaments, we have to take up our responsibility, and I hope that we all are successful in this way. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Also for your philosophical statements coming from a long political experience, and your reference to Libya shows quite clearly at this very specific example, Europe has a need for action and should take action together. Now, the next speaker will be from Holland, and I look forward to welcome President Elke Nikos-Kolle.
Let me first congratulate you on a very well-organized and interesting conference. I would also like to thank you for the outstanding and welcoming dinner yesterday in the beautiful city of Vienna. Secondly, I thank you for your honorable invitation to speak here today on the subject of further development of the cooperation between national parliaments and European institutions among these eminent and eloquent colleagues, Wolfgang Schäuble, Gérard Larcher, and Marek Kuczynski. Almost 10 years ago, at the 43rd COSAC in Madrid, I gave a speech on the topic, the new model for relations between national parliaments and the European Parliament after the entry into force of the Treaty of Lisbon. The speech tackled the various possibilities to create an effective model for cooperation. Many of the topics that we are discussing today were addressed back then as well. I then made the point that we must avoid starting up a lot of new interparliamentary conferences, as this would in all probability not contribute to the essential process of strengthening relations between national parliaments and the European institutions. But on the other hand, that we must put more focus into the discussions among ourselves. I discussed the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality and the role of IPEX and other forms of what was then called electronic communication between parliaments. I stressed that we must never forget the reason for interparliamentary cooperation between national parliaments and the European Parliament, namely to connect and to reconnect the citizens of Europe with the European project. And here we are, 10 years later, and a few newly introduced IPCs further down the road, talking about all these issues again ahead of the 2019 European elections. But instead of reiterating the thoughts I then shared with my audience on effective models for cooperation, let me now focus mainly on the aspect of interparliamentary cooperation and, more precise, on the importance of interparliamentary dialogue. The year 2019 will undoubtedly be again a year with unprecedented events and political changes. And I'm not referring to the Brexit events, which will mark the year 2019 as a central point in a highly emotional and very disturbing political opera. In the complex world of today, no single member state can tackle issues like terrorism, climate change, and migration alone. Working together means having more clout also in global trade and geopolitics. We have to stand and work together to achieve goals that go beyond the interests of individual sovereign states. Having said this, however, I personally do not support the idea of a federal Europe. For me, it's clear that the European Union is a unification of people, not states. We have to make sure that the priorities of the people are the EU's priorities. And above all, we need to be aware of the fact that citizens increasingly feel a loss of identity and are unsure of the future. It is the duty of the EU institutions and of the national politicians to seek a balance between a closely working together union on the one hand and the acceptance by citizens of some unification on specific subjects on the other. National parliaments, together with the European Parliament, are ideally placed to reaffirm the connection between EU citizens and the EU. Parliamentarians are in the position to make sure that the policies the EU pursues are based on public acceptance and benefit the citizens of our respective member states. Our national parliaments are and must be the voice of our citizens. It is also essential that we as politicians keep our promises, because citizens choose the politicians that they trust the most. But these promises, in my view, have to be realistic and of a nature to support the idea of doing things together, not countermand them. It can sometimes be difficult to explain to our citizens all the nuances of European policy, but let's be clear, the EU is not the bad guy. Young people growing up in the EU take many of the achievements of the EU for granted, and so does a large part of the older generation. We, as parliamentarians, need to address the issue of the added value of the EU for the day-to-day life of our citizens. And that also means that we have to be clear about EU proposals that we think are not in the interest of our citizens. National parliaments should also be more transparent and accountable about their position on EU policy and on the possibility to influence this. Being open and transparent about what the EU does and how these decisions come about is essential. It is clear that procedures in the EU are difficult. Citizens should, however, be able to understand this process and be able to follow and even influence decisions through their national parliaments. Not only is this an essential prerequisite of democracy, it helps to build trust in the EU. In this regard, let me say a few words on the importance of interparliamentary meetings. Building personal connections across European countries opens doors and facilitates conversations and discussions. In my experience, during the various interparliamentary conferences I attended, it is not our intent to come up with solutions for the many challenges that face Europe. We exchange information, best practices and opinions, and we go home enriched with what we heard and learned from our colleagues. So let us use our valuable time together to have honest and frank discussions among ourselves, not lengthy monologues. There are some practical arrangements that can be introduced to stimulate discussions, which we can discuss further during the debate. I mentioned, for instance, and I was delighted to see this setup where the speakers sit closely around the table, a situation where we can look each other in the eye, and that's very, very important. And also, we can introduce moderators more often who are experienced in stimulating a more lively debate among delegations. To conclude, let us seek to form connections that can end up proving invaluable in creating the common ground that Europe so desperately needs. We owe it to those we represent, the people of the European Union, that we, parliamentarians, both national and European, cooperate effectively for the benefit of our citizens so that indeed all European citizens feel connected to the European project, to the European Union, to a prosperous future. Thank you.
Vielen herzlichen Dank für Ihre Keynote.
Thank you very much for this keynote speech. You mentioned something very fundamental, the relationship of our citizens with Europe. And you did say that Europe often is seen as the bad guy, which it isn't. Very often we say it's Europe, it's Brussels, which is responsible. And in truth, it's something we have not been able to solve. It's something our predecessors have been discussing already, and it's something that is difficult to overcome, but we may succeed in this. Our next keynote speaker is the President of the French Senate, Gérard Larcher. The floor is yours.
Mr. President, dear colleagues, once again, thank you very much for your welcome here in Vienna. Tomorrow, the heads of states and government of the 27 member states of the European Union will examine the request by Madam Theresa May of another postponement of the Brexit. Of course, an orderly withdrawal of the United Kingdom is preferable to an exit without an agreement, but the European Union cannot be conditioned on the long term by all the successive votes of the Common House in Britain. With all the respect for parliamentary democracy, we have to say this, that all of our reports seem to be conditioned by a clarification that we need from London on the modalities of the retreat and the withdrawal. And this is the position that I've explained to the President of our government in recent days. In a few weeks, European citizens are called upon to vote in order to define who will be their representatives in the European Parliament. Now, in 2019 is a year that will be an end, or will it be a new start? And I'm convinced that unless we have a genuine re-establishment of Europe, Europe will not be in a position to take up the challenges and cope with them. We know, and the Dutch colleague told us, that our citizens sometimes have difficulty in finding themselves and recognizing themselves in what Europe is, and they feel that this has come so far away from their aspirations. And very often the national governments have turned Europe into a scapegoat for their own lack of success. And our priority should therefore be to bring about an appeasement between Europe and its citizens. And that's what we expect from all the efficiency and the pragmatism. And I would like to refer to a interview in March. And it said that Europe should prove itself to be more effective. The problems are so urgent, so no country can solve them by themselves. And I fully share this view. And this will have its value. We will have to redefine Europe. We will have to look look for the added value of Europe, the efficiency, effectiveness. And this should be finished and concentrated on priorities on what is expected by citizens. It is true that citizens want, first of all, a Europe that protects them. Given all the challenges by migration, we need to reform the Dublin and the Schengen Agreement. We have to harmonize asylum regulations, and we have to conduct a European policy in the field of migration that helps the countries of origin, in particular when it comes to their commitment in the readmission structure. And the second priority is to give the European Union a policy in the that will lead to more employment and will understand and will support the research and industry so that we become again European champions. And let's act together for the digital agenda and for artificial intelligence. Let's be the first ones to organize this industrial revolution. It's not a question of looking at the competition rules, but we have to become the champions here. And the third priority is that of the foreign and defense policy. Today, multilateralism is eroding. We see a return of the trade wars and the disintegration of the international financial architecture. The world order is emanating, and we see here some protectionist trends from the United States and also from China. And we can see that European Union does not act as the power that it should be. So if it wants to remain the leading economic powers, then all the trade agreements have to be strengthened. And if the Europeans have for a long time given defense issues to NATO and the United States, and now they need to become more committed because there are many challenges to our security. So we have to develop our own strategy, and we also have to define our common foreign policy and be credible so that we are a Europower and that we are a strong Europe and we can be heard in the concert of nations. And these initiatives do not depend on the adoption of new treaties or putting into place new superstructures. Let's not get lost in institutional discussions, but let's act with pragmatism. And this difficulties between the East and the South, the North and the West, this is something that we will have to tackle to preserve our European unity. The national parliaments, they represent the people, and they have a very important role to play in order to bring Europe closer to the citizens. I'm thinking here of strengthening the role as guardians of the principle of subsidiarity. So we also must make sure that this principle is better respected. So this is the contribution that we have to make. If we have presented this in Bratislava in 2006, so we would say that the national parliaments should have a motivated voice to play, and we should also recognize that the national parliament should have a right of initiatives. So we have more cooperation between parliaments, especially in fields like defense and security. And these proposals have been taken up by a task force on subsidiarity, and this was set up on the initiative of President Jean-Claude Juncker. We have to take this into action now. And 2019, this is a year which has all the challenges. Europe is at a turning point when it wants to build up its future or would like to stay where it stands. And let me quote what was written by a great French writer, and it's almost 100 years that he said so, and it was Paul Valéry. He said Europe should become what it really is in reality, which means a small head of the Asian continent, question mark, or will Europe stay what it is, namely the very precious part of the universe, the pearl of the atmosphere, and the head of a big body? So we have to look at the dangers that we're facing, and we must have the ambition to be the brain for this big body. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, President Larcher, also for this passionate statement which you have given and which has shown to us that pragmatic action is what Europe needs on all levels. And it shows that, especially as regards the relationship with the United Kingdom, France is a country which has a specific position also as regards subsidiarity. We are also in favor of extending the deadlines for subsidiarity objections and the likes. Our last keynote speaker is from Poland, from the Polish Sejm, Marek Kuczynski. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, allow me to join all the thanks and appreciation that we have addressed you, sir, for organizing this conference, for the climate of the whole meeting. And also, I would like to say that I do support the opinions and the views and the comments that have so far been expressed during the previous speeches. 2019, allow me to stress that, is yet exceptional for another reason. And another good reason to have a thorough debate on cooperation in Europe, because this year we are celebrating the 30th anniversary of free elections in Central Europe after the fall of communism, which took place in 1989 in Poland. We are also celebrating the anniversary of the Velvet Revolution in the previous Czechoslovakia, and also the anniversary of changes in Hungary. These events have occurred before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and they changed the face of Europe, Central Europe, and prepared the grounds for the unification of Europe. After 30 years and 15 years of our presence of Central Europe in the EU, allow me to attract your attention to several challenges while speaking about those main subjects. And I think that this is where we find the recipes for the future. First, we think that in the EU, we are now facing a crisis of values. The last years have shown divisions among member states, and they make them aware, they've made us aware that common identity cannot or should not be based exclusively on economic or institutional foundations separately from the cultural and social awareness. Because Europe is not just a market that does not have a soul. I did have the possibility yesterday, before the conference, to go to Gusen, Mauthausen. a very painful place, a place that we remember where horrible things happened 50 years ago. Local authorities, Austrian local authorities, have been taking good care of these places. But these places, in the context of our talks about the future of Europe, they very well correspond, especially if we take into account the anniversary of these events, and I'm thinking about the whole historical context. Because Europe has Christian roots, and from these roots stems the respect for other people and tolerance as well. And I think that based on these values, we should seek optimum solutions in order to strengthen European identity. Secondly, we are worried, as far as the EU is concerned, by a certain form of disappearance of functioning of the law, because we are dealing with unequal treatment of member states. The treaties and subsidiarity principle are at the basis of the EU. The treaties define the competences of the states and of the EU institutions, and this limit is often overcome by or violated by the EU. Today we can see different treatment by those member states that joined the EU in 2004 or later, and different treatment towards so-called old member states. We have an example of the judiciary in Poland and the Polish reform of the judiciary. Its organization, according to the Lisbon Treaty, is an internal competence of the member states. If a judicial institution exists in a given member state, it does have to exist in a different member state and function according to the same rules. The Poles did want this reform because in the Polish judiciary, since the communist times, we have seen the growth of different pathologies, among others, due to the absence of the equality of powers. So the changes that we have conducted are consistent with the treaties and the Polish constitution, and above all, what I would like to stress, they are consistent with the solutions that are also present in many other EU member states, the representatives of which are present in this room. What is being reproached to Poland, that we do not respect the rule of law, is completely unfounded. And in my opinion, this is formulated, among others, for the purpose of the current electoral campaign to the European Parliament, which has to be assessed as an interference with internal affairs of a given state, and we can no longer accept this non-treaty practice. The third matter is a democratic EU. Democratic European Union requires stronger national parliaments. The reform of the EU system should be accompanied by a real democratic mandate granted within the national electoral process. In my opinion, it is a major mistake that has so far occurred within the EU is underestimating this matter. Restoring the balance between national parliaments and EU institutions should be an important purpose of the renewal of the EU and of strengthening of the EU. And the fourth point that I would like to raise is as follows. The EU shall take care of its unity. And I think we can all agree with that. We have to take care of member states' solidarity. We also agree that the strength of the EU does not stem exclusively from the strength of single member states, but from this community that we all create. But in this context, we do need a fresh approach to the multi-annual financial framework for 2021 and 2027. Here, with some apprehension, we have seen proposed cuts as regards the financing of the agricultural policy and the cohesion policy. In my opinion, trying to find solutions to these challenges, this depends to a great extent on the cooperation between member states. The EU, we agree, is a great success, but the reforms are necessary. The European Union, diverse European Union, we speak different languages. We have different histories, different customs. We have to respect different cultures, and being different in a united European Union is the very foundation of the European Union. Thank you so much.
Vielen herzlichen Dank für Ihre Ausführungen.
Thank you very much for your remarks, which have reminded us of the fact that only 30 years ago we were in a completely different Europe. As Austrians, we know what it meant to be close to the Iron Curtain. And we will also continue remembering this. Several initiatives have been started to overcome these old borders and to make a difference between what was in the past and what we have now. And what you said about being united in diversity is certainly true. And this should be the approach we should follow. Let us now start our debate. We have 17 requests for the floor. The speaking time is limited to 4 minutes each. We will start with the president of the Swedish Riksdag, Mr. Nylund. You have the floor.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. President, dear colleagues. Let me first make a few comments on the scrutiny of how we as member states respect the fundamental values of our union. When we discussed the enlargement process yesterday, several of us underlined that it's important that we have a close scrutiny when new member states wish to enter the European Union. We have to scrutinize very carefully that they have a justice system, an independent judiciary, that they follow and respect the European values in many aspects. I do think it's a problem that we have too weak processes when it comes to scrutinizing countries once they have entered the European Union. We have seen in recent years actions which have caused concern among many of us that some of our member states are undermining the independence of the judiciary, the rule of law, the freedom of the media, and the freedom of civil society. And there have been actions taken by the Commission and the Council, but it's obvious that these processes are, you could say, rather weak, and that they may have to be strengthened in the future in order for us to maintain a European Union based on fundamental values such as independence of the judiciary, freedom of the media, and all of those things we all cherish. Let me then turn to something much more down to earth. 10 years have passed since the EU Speakers Conference in Lisbon agreed on the guidelines for interparliamentary cooperation in the EU. Since then, the Lisbon Treaty has entered into force, and we have seen an extensive development of the EU's interparliamentary cooperation. The Speakers Conference has established no less than 3 standing interparliamentary meetings in addition to COSAC. The interparliamentary meeting for the evaluation of Eurojust will add another one. The practices of the European Parliament towards interparliamentary cooperation have also developed, most notably with the introduction of the annual European Parliamentary Week. In my opinion, the main value of the EU IPC guidelines is to give a comprehensive and accurate notion of the function and features of the EU interparliamentary cooperation. I'm therefore very pleased to find that the proposal to update the guidelines has been included in the draft conclusions. The idea is not to fundamentally revise the guidelines. Rather, the process should aim at ensuring that the guidelines correctly reflect the way the EU interparliamentary cooperation operates. On this point, I believe that the draft conclusions are sufficient, focusing on closer alignment with the treaty provision, new functions and meeting constellations, as well as the potential in using modern means of communications. Despite not being specifically mentioned in the conclusions, the process will, in my opinion, also provide scope for reflection on the efficiency of interparliamentary EU cooperation, for instance, in terms of coordination and technical support. we always have to use public funds with great respect, and we need a well-structured interparliamentary cooperation, and it would be very good, I think, if we could follow important issues with a more long-term perspective rather than having meetings and conferences with a more ad hoc character. And I think it would be very interesting to discuss this in the years to come. I'm equally pleased to find that the interparliamentary meeting for the evaluation of Eurojust has been included in the conclusions. To conclude, I am confident that our Finnish colleagues will take both of these issues forward, the Eurojust issue and the EU IPC guidelines issue, in the best possible way. The Swedish Parliament is ready to contribute to this process. Thank you.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much, President, especially for the proposal that we review the guidelines for interparliamentary cooperation to prepare this in a working group, and to ask the next presidency, the Finnish presidency, to find ways and means how we can ensure Eurojust. And I think there is a section in the conclusions, in the draft conclusions, and I think the interparliamentary work, it was mentioned by many colleagues, we want to strengthen this, and we want to use this network. We want to use this exchange of experience, and thus want to strengthen cooperation of the parliaments. The next speaker on our list is the Portuguese president, Ferreira Rodrigues. You have the floor, sir.
Monsieur le Président Sobotka, je vous remercie.
President Sobotka, I would like to thank you once again, dear colleagues. Since 2019 is a challenging year for Europe. If there is Brexit, and Brexit is to remind us of that, and we shouldn't be surprised that society is so divided. Especially after the crisis of 2008 and 2009, we are confronted now with centrifugal forces, nationalist forces, and they turned the European Union into the scapegoat for all these ill events. And but we know that only a united Europe will give us a possibility to defend our interest on a global level. Never have we known so many freedoms, and we have to give proof of that, of what is evident. It is our responsibility as in a democracy to do so, as members of national parliaments and as members of the European Parliament. We are citizens of our countries, and we are also citizens of Europe. And the Lisbon Treaty is quite clear. National parliaments are participants, active participants in the operation and functioning of the European Union, and the European Parliament makes sure that the representative democracy is ensured for European citizens vis-à-vis the institutions of the European Union. And the big challenges are known. There is globalization, there is precarious work, there are inequalities, there is unemployment, especially among young people, there is migration, there is demographic aging of the population. These are the challenges that require replies on a European level. So we must take up this agenda and work on it. And this agenda must be based on a European Union that is competitive, humanitarian, and with solidarity. And it will also be a European Union that is in a position that can answer to the big challenges of security, including the fight against terrorism. And it should be the driving force of a multilateralism that is currently in a crisis. And this is an instrument to renew sovereignty in an unlimited way. And this will bring the other result would only be that we are weakened. And we should be acting in policies that aim at others. And this does not mean that we are not close to our citizens. One example, and this shows what importance Portugal gives to the monetary and economic union. And this will give us more resilience. And it's also the reason by which we need to have a cohesion policy, and we shouldn't compromise budgetary restraints and the reduction of public debt vis-à-vis the GDP. In the 21st century, Europe is nothing. It's an option, and it needs a solution. And we are therefore afraid, we're therefore not afraid, to deepen the construction of Europe. And this will lead us to bring us freedom, and will bring us separation of powers, independence of the systems, the judicial systems, freedom of the press, the rule of law, and our democracy, and freedom and the freedom of our citizens. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this contribution, which reminds us of the basic foundation of the Treaty of Lisbon. The next speaker is the President from Croatia, Jakovic.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, thank you for excellent organization and perfect dinner yesterday. Dear colleagues, we have been witnessing a number of challenges within the European Union, but also globally, which have direct implications on our common construction of Europe. The list of challenges is long, from Brexit, migration, climate and demographic changes, to disrespect of international law, just to name a few. We have to respond to these challenges by continuing to be active on the international scene, but also internally by continuously promoting our values and principles of unity, engagement, responsibility, solidarity, and partnership. All mentioned challenges have also negatively affected citizens' confidence in the European project and have consequently given rise to Eurosceptic voices. The European elections are due in just over a month's time in such a changed environment. These elections represent a decisive moment for the future development of the European Union. They will be an indicator of whether we have been able to establish an open dialogue with the citizens on our future, and a sign whether we have managed to respond to their expectations, concerns, and needs, and to convince them that Europe is not just the market, but a historical achievement, a unique project of peace, freedom, progress, and above all, values. In this month prior to the elections, our responsibility is to respond resolutely to disinformation campaigns and to promote truth and constructive and positive narrative about Europe and its achievements. It is important to ensure free and fair European elections and to increase voters' turnout. And to do that, we have to respond effectively to the spreading of populist policies and fake news. First of all, because Euroscepticism provokes new divisions and heightens the sense of insecurity among citizens. Therefore, it is important to offer our citizens accountable European policies and the choice of responsible candidates for the European Parliament. One way to respond to the expectations of our citizens is also to strike the right balance between the European Union and the Member States. To do that, it is necessary to better understand subsidiarity and proportionality. And all proposals aimed at strengthening these principles are more than welcome. To conclude, it is necessary to update our guidelines. The task force should also evaluate the work and the added value of the existing interparliamentary fora in the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A review of the guidelines has been put on the agenda, and Sweden will tackle this. And as far as the attractiveness of candidates is concerned, this will certainly be very important so that citizens will give their trust to the candidates. And we now come to the Iberian Peninsula, and Pastor Julian will be the next speaker from Spain.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the Austrian people and Parliament, its hospitality. And I would like to congratulate you, Mr. President, for having, in such a magnificent way, organized this meeting and the success of your 6-month presidency of the Council. We, all Europeans, should be voting at the end of May to renew the European Parliament. This is the moment in which we have to think through more than ever about the relevant issues in the European area: freedom and security, terrorism, the social and economic agenda, climate change, or the reform of the monetary and economic union, as Portugal was saying. Europe is going through a watershed moment in its history that will probably define the way it evolves in the years to come. The announced exit from the United Kingdom, the rise of formations that question the achievements of the community project, or the growing uncertainty, the globalist scenario, are phenomena that concern us all. Populisms seek to undermine the project of peace and prosperity that has taken us all decades, with a false idea about failure that only fits the vision of those who want to manipulate reality for their own benefit. On the other hand, uncertainty about Brexit is also posing great challenge for all of us. We must continue to combine, as has been done, the necessary common position and defense of the European project with the design of a new framework of relations with the United Kingdom. Dear colleagues, the commitment to intensification of the cooperation between the European Parliament and national parliaments is, without doubt, one of the most effective ways to apply in practice the role that must be given to citizens, which are the ones we represent. We will all win if we manage to articulate the appropriate mechanisms so that the national parliaments have a greater role in the European constructions. This is something lacking now. Indeed, it is our changes that can contribute to reinforcing the democratic legitimacy. The debates, national policy debates, should be better in sync with current community affairs. These will strengthen the sense of belonging to the collective process. It seems to me mandatory that we vindicate the constant and gradual advances that we have achieved, but we have to go on, as has been said, revising the guidelines on parliamentary cooperation. Schuman was saying that Europe will not be made all at once or according to a single general plan. It will be built through concrete achievements which first created de facto solidarity. We have to achieve consensus on certain issues, like, for instance, cybersecurity. Hayek, an Austrian thinker in Road to Serfdom, was warning us about the risk that on the basis of the control of information, a uniformity of points of view may be imposed that will end up suppressing our freedom. Let us take advantage of the opportunities that the new technologies provide us. We have to articulate the necessary tools in order to work on cybersecurity, the use of big data, or the use of the new technologies. Let us adapt. Let us develop scenarios and legislative reforms in this sense. This is essential. We have to face several challenges, and in Spain we will continue to make a contribution to provide appropriate answers to the problems of the 21st century, but always on the basis of pluralism and the legitimacy of the Spanish. A Spanish thinker said that European culture is a perpetual work in progress. It is not an inn where you stop and stay, but a road that always forces us to constantly be on the march. We have to give a greater role to national parliaments. One meeting every year is sufficient. We need to meet more often. Our commitment in Spain is to support this Europe that has given us so many benefits to each of us in Spain. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Vielen herzlichen Dank für den
Thank you very much for this important contribution and for mentioning the topic of cyber security. We also wish you all the best for the upcoming elections in Spain, and you will be standing again, I hear, so all the best for your endeavors. The next speaker is the president of the Slovenian parliament, Dejan Židan.
Gospod predsednik.
Dear President, dear colleagues, good morning. Today in the morning, we were together with Mr. President Sobotka, had the honor, an honorable task, to be opening a memorial plate to Mr. Anton Janša. He was a pioneer of global and European beekeeping. But why am I talking about it? We had a common project some years ago. We had a common project, Slovenian, but there was Serbia, Montenegro, Hungary, Austria, Germany, France. Many countries joined in our common vision how to protect biodiversity, and we succeeded. We received our World Bee Day because we had a common idea which connected us. Distinguished members of the parliaments, when the European Union was beginning to develop itself, I was only a child. So I'm now reading about solidarity, unity, I'm reading about the rule of law, and also I'm reading about efficiency and success. So I'm reading about the vision which brought us together. Now, when we are thinking about it, how to come further with the European Union is actually the first step to read history, to make it our line of thought and to respect it. Also, we are talking about Brexit. Brexit is, for me, mostly a very sad story, and it shows the defeat of the European Union. I sincerely hope and I wish that the people would have another option to vote again now that they have new information. You see, at the first occasion, there were too many disinformation, too many negative messages, too many false promises. And the example of Brexit shows where exactly populism leads us, where false promises leads us, which then realize. Distinguished guests, in Slovenia, we do strongly believe into the European Union. We will be strong members of it, and we wish that we would think more closely on our roots. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you for your statement. Norway is next on the list. Tone Trøen. I hope I am pronouncing your name correctly.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Chair. First, let me, on behalf of the 3 EFTA states present, Iceland, Switzerland, and Norway, thank the Austrian Parliament and to you, Speaker, Mr. Sobotka, for the warm welcome and hospitality at this meeting here in Vienna. I would also like to thank you all for the interesting debates and perspectives shared so far. Even though we are not a member of the EU, the discussions on relations to neighbors, enlargement, and of course the relations between national parliaments and the EU institutions are of great interest to us. It is very useful for us to take part in these meetings and to meet colleagues from all over Europe. I would like to take this opportunity to highlight the EEA agreement that has its 25th anniversary this year. EU and EEA heads of state and governments at the EU summit on the 22nd of March also properly marked this. At the EU summit, the Council President Donald Tusk said that the EEA agreement is not a short-term transaction, but a long-term partnership. I think the experiences over the 25 years clearly demonstrates that. The agreement has contributed to securing welfare and jobs, both in the EU and in Norway and the other EEA and EFTA states. The single market is the cornerstone of the cooperation and key to further growth and prosperity. We believe in close European cooperation to find solutions to challenges like climate change and migration, but also social inclusion and injustice. Doing so is all the more important as populism feeds off discontent and anxiety. We must maintain our citizens' trust in European cooperation. Development in the EU's neighbourhood is crucially important for all of us. It is essential to promote stability, peace, and democracy as key factors for ensuring economic and social progress. Thank you very much for your attention.
Vielen herzlichen Dank für den Beitrag.
Thank you very much for this contribution. And the next speaker comes from Hungary, and I ask President Laszlo Kövér to take the floor.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, in the history of our continent, we are now approaching the end of one of the most unsuccessful 5-year periods. When we come to the end of this institutional cycle, the EU failed to protect its external border. It was in a state of paralysis when it was watching the biggest migration flow ever experienced in our continent since the end of the Second World War. And as a result of this state of paralysis, we have lost one of our strongest member states, the United Kingdom. The EU is at a crossroads today. Every European leader has understood that the community must be given a new direction. Hungary welcomes all those initiatives that wish to raise the debate to a higher level and provide the framework for a genuine, constructive dialogue concerning our shared future. In the early days of March, the President of France as well as the President of the German ruling party presented their positions concerning the future of Europe. And in spite of the close cooperation between these countries, these two future visions are rather different from one another, and yet we can accept them as a starting point for a continued frank dialogue. According to Hungary's position, the EU does not need to be re-established. However, we cannot postpone certain changes any further. Hungary has always been in favor of the idea of a strong Europe composed of strong nation states, taking into consideration the different characteristics of the member states and looking upon these differences in line with the motto of the European Union as assets. In our opinion, the EU must return to the roots that enabled the European Union to become the most successful project of the 20th century. It must return to the legacy of the Christian civilization. And in line with the legacy of our founding fathers, we must pursue mutual interest and seeking consensus when we cooperate. Obviously, the European Union has shifted away from the citizens whose interest it is expected to advocate, and this resulted in a democratic legitimacy crisis. As many emphasized before me, in the European Union today, we must enforce the principle of subsidiarity, whereby Brussels will only take action in cases when by its action it really creates added value. Brussels must understand that in many cases the national level is much better positioned to adopt decisions and to take action. A consistent application of the principle of subsidiarity would enable the citizens of Europe to increase their trust in the institutions of the European Union, and the EU could once again get closer to the citizens. Hungary has for a long time been a supporter of a so-called emergency brake mechanism, or in other words, the red card procedure, whereby the scrutinizing role of national parliaments would be strengthened when the subsidiarity principle is violated. And eventually, we must also return to the rules that we all committed to. That is, we must comply with the provisions of the founding treaties, the fundamental treaties. This means that the European Parliament must refrain from interfering in the internal affairs of the member state, and the Commission must put an end to its political activism, which only generates differences between the member states. The Commission must put an end to the application of double standards against the Central and Eastern European member states, states, because this will not, and it must also end lecturing up the member states, because this will only undermine the trust of the citizens in the political institutions of the EU, but it will also prevent the member states from functioning in a normal way. We hope that after the EU elections, these changes will occur. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this contribution. It showed us quite clearly that subsidiarity is, of course, has different perspectives, and that the new parliament will need a lot of sensitivity, and also the Commission will need a lot of sensitivity so that we have a good result. And the next speaker is the president from Cyprus, Dimitrios Silouris.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, the European Union, despite its progress as concerns the important challenges it's been faced with, its multifaceted challenges for that matter, still the EU has not managed to eliminate the lack of trust that is shown by the European citizens vis-à-vis the European institutions. So that deficit is still there. And unfortunately, it's been taken advantage of by various populist voices that are on the rise, and they are gaining more ground. But in order for us to make sure there's no deficit and no void that will be taken advantage by the populists, we must undertake actions and we must enforce policies in order for us to provide real answers to real problems by enforcing principles in a uniform manner and therefore by getting results. Otherwise, of course, the void eventually will be filled in by others, and the populists will rise further. Quite often, they nonetheless opt for imaginative proposals. And let me add one more thing. For many years in a row, we were carried away and opted for communication approaches. We rather abandoned real policy making during that time. You see, populism should not be allowed to win over real politics. We have to make sure that we pursue results. We have to make sure that we stick to our principles. And I guess populists will try to take advantage of the fact that we are insisting on communication and the media over politics. So we ought to put real problems at the core of our policy making. Let's forget about the various impressionable approaches. And after all, or rather, lastly, let me say that Europe will be judged on the basis of its efficacy. And especially when it comes to difficult issues and its weaknesses, it has to produce results. And on that note, let me thank you.
Thank you very much. And Italy is the next speaker, President Fico.
Mr. Speaker, dear President Sobotka, dear colleagues, I do not take it for granted the fact that I'm here, that I'm able to talk together, to conduct a dialogue. This should not be taken for granted, because it was not something that was to be taken for granted in the past, and we cannot take it for granted now. We have behind us 2 world wars, death and destruction. So what we are doing together here is very important, and we should be aware of this. Europe today is faced with 3 possible routes, approaches. The first approach is going on as we're doing now without focusing on the new issues and to remain the way we are, but this is only a slow form of death. There are many speakers who want to hearken back to nation states, nationalist approaches. This is, again, a form of backstepping. We would be stepping back. The third approach is reforming Europe towards closer integration. Closer integration. We need one strong Europe. We need a strong European Parliament. We need a common foreign and defense policy at European level. Europe should have within the Security Council of the United Nations a single seat, a European permanent seat, to speak with a single voice. Unless we pursue a common foreign policy, we would pursue weaker foreign policies. And this is very clear in Libya, the Libyan crisis, where Europe has not been able to speak with a single voice. And if now, from Libya, many people in distress, because those who leave their homes, their countries, are people in distress, if they were to come to our shores, we would have a crisis in the Mediterranean and a crisis in Europe, even though the Libyan crisis was very clear on the cards. This means that we need a common foreign policy. We need a united, joint, comprehensive vision. We must make all possible efforts to this effect. Another important endeavor would be to scrutinize all the new applicants, to be very strict in our scrutiny of the rule of law, of the rights of minorities, of pluralism in the media, free speech, all basic principles enshrined in our constitutions. All the rights that we enjoy in Europe must be enhanced in the applicant countries. This is also true to the current member states, of the European Union. If I may, I would like to make one further point, which I raised in a letter that I sent to all of you concerning the Italian researcher Giulio Regeni, who was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered in Egypt. The Egyptian state is reticent. They have not even started a trial. In Italy, 5 members of the Egyptian security forces are under investigation. I'm asking for your assistance, for your help. Giulio Regeni was a European researcher, not only an Italian researcher. If we want to be a united Europe, we need to be united in these struggles. It is very important. This is the right to truth and justice. Thank you.
Vielen herzlichen Dank auch für die Perspektive wiederum nach Nord.
Thank you very much for opening up the perspective towards Northern Africa again, of course. This also shows how strong Europe can be, or if it is indeed weak, in finding a common reply. Our next speaker, unfortunately the microphone was turned off, is from France.
Et cette très belle idée hier soir de la visite du musée.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for the invitation to last night's dinner at the museum. Our nation states have probably never found their place in the European project. In 1989, there was an initiative of the French National Assembly which led to the foundation of the COSAC conference, and here the competences between the Union and the member states were discussed, also with regard to a new assessment of our common initiatives. In order to fill interparliamentary cooperation with new life, every member state should find a way of sending their representatives in a more consistent way to these conferences. In order to be successful, we also need to make our economic platform and exchange platform IPEX more efficient. We also need to further tap into the networks which we have. We need to have an informal and quick information exchange system, which is similar to what our permanent representatives have. This is essential if we want to include national parliaments in European debates and make sure that new legislative proposals can also be assessed by the parliament. Only if we organize ourselves in a better way, our parliaments can again be put to the fore of European developments. We need to be closer to national realities, need to get closer to our citizens again. National and European parliaments have a joint responsibility in guaranteeing a further development of our democratic systems. They have a complementary role in this. All this can give a contribution to strengthening our members of parliament, the national and European parliaments, in a positive way. Designating in the national groups a correspondent who will have to make sure that the link between national parliamentarians is held up will be an advantage in this. In this way, our national parliaments can also nominate a liaison for cooperation with European members of parliament. We also request Council of Ministers to study these kinds of developments. And it would also be good to make sure that the Commission can be requested to give reasoned replies to our requests. We should never be afraid of changing habits. The French Assembly and the German Bundestag, Mr. Schäuble has mentioned this, has just founded a binational assembly, the French-German Assembly, which will now also debate suggestions which are linked to our European developments. If we want to make sure that Europe is filled with life, it has to come closer to our European citizens again. We should avoid the spreading of wrong ideas and disinformation. Europe has to be an area of peace and prosperity for our citizens. It has to find new legitimacy by being based on democratic processes. Our citizens have to be put in a position to have a close and standing link to the European Parliament. Thank you very much.
Vielen herzlichen Dank für den wesentlichen Beitrag.
Thank you for this contribution. For the ongoing debate, we have another 7 requests for the floor, and the speaking time is restricted to 4 minutes. I would like to invite you to respect the allotted speaking time so that everyone will have sufficient time to take the floor. The next speaker on the list is the representative of Finland, the first vice president of the Finnish Parliament, Mauri Pekkarinen, has the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank you, our host, very much for organizing this very important and very interesting meeting we have had here in Vienna. Dear colleagues, voter participation in European elections has gone down since elections started. If voters feel that European elections don't matter, it would be foolish to say they are wrong. We should accept that something is broken in European politics, and we can either fix it or make it worse. We politicians should talk politics to our voters. When it comes to Europe, our message is too often technical, apolitical, and defensive. We need to present Europe as a political arena where different ideas compete. All politics is about changing the status quo. When we disagree with current EU policies, We should attack them and propose our own solutions. European politics is politics, political choices that can and must be challenged and debated. Voters can be mobilized to vote for competing ideas. If we are too polite, we create the impression that the only real choice is between more of the same and leaving the EU. Don't vocalize our disagreements. Otherwise, we give up the game to the populists. Or else, we give voters an excuse for not voting. Each of us has a different vision of what our voters need and want. Europe is essentially a platform for achieving concrete goals. Voters don't care about more Europe or less Europe. They certainly do not care about European institutional details. Voters are moved by a choice among competing policies for stopping climate change and creating jobs, security and prosperity. The European project needs to be defended, but its defense lies in what it delivers, less in its ideals. The EU is legitimate when both the Union and its politics are constantly challenged in parliaments, debated and confirmed. Defending the EU is the job of politicians, not of parliaments as institutions. Parliaments must be open to those who challenge the system. Parliaments best defend the European ideas by being open to its opponents. The European project in any open debate, I believe. Interparliamentary cooperation is important, but we need to be realistic. Our cooperation is a support function. It allows us to network, to get information, and to compare best practices. Our main job, however, is always to represent our own electorates. The European Parliament has a carefully defined role as representative of the peoples of Europe. National parliaments are sovereign representatives of their peoples. The legitimacy of the EU depends on the balance between these tasks. The Finnish Eduskunta, also Parliament, has undertaken the chair of working group to review the guidelines for interparliamentary cooperation in the EU. The guidelines are descriptive. The Helsinki Speakers Conference next year will discuss a description of how interparliamentary cooperation works. This includes the understanding that interparliamentary cooperation supports but can never replace the work done separately in each parliament. The best contribution we can make to strengthen the European Union is to fight the European election vigorously. We need to emphasize our differences on economics, social policy, migration, whatever. We need to show the voters that they have a meaningful choice between policies. This will force the anti-European populists to show whether they have better concrete policies or are just simple nihilists bent on destruction. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Vizepräsident.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The next speaker is the representative of Malta. Claudette Buttigieg has the floor.
Mr. President, thank you so much. I join all the other Really lovely messages we had this morning to thank you for your warm hospitality, especially for welcoming us in such an engaging program for yesterday and today. Thank you so much. Colleagues, the European Union has since its inception proven to be a stable and resilient union, with many countries in the region having worked or still working hard to meet the criteria necessary for accession. Its ability to bring enviable peace and prosperity to a region which had for centuries been fraught with empires and countries at war remains a cause for celebration of what the European Union has achieved. Of course, the road to this achievement was not always smooth. However, we have to acknowledge that each stumbling block that the EU needed to overcome only made the Union stronger, as President Schauber said earlier on today. For example, the modern economic governance model that the euro area can boast of was made possible due to the need to address the causes and effects of the financial crisis, which hit a number of member states only a few years ago. Thus, I believe that we have to face the challenges with determination, not only to resolve, but to come out together and stronger from them. If we do not refer to the Brexit saga when talking about our common future, we would be avoiding the proverbial elephant in the room. As we watch Brexit take its full course and await the outcome of the future relationship with the EU, as parliamentarians, we must recognize that in spite of changing its nature, our relationship with the United Kingdom will remain, and the interparliamentary dimension of this relationship will also need to feature in discussions at the appropriate levels. Once the UK has fully and formally withdrawn from the EU, there will remain 27 other members, with many more aspiring to join, as we discussed in the first session yesterday, who still believe in the Union and the values that it is founded upon. I believe that one of the most fundamental values that brings us together is that of democracy and the respect for democratic legitimacy. Each and every one of us here represents the epitome of democratic expression in our countries. I like to see this not as a privilege, but as a heavy burden that we carry, the responsibility of being the true representatives of the will of the people we have been elected to serve. As parliaments, we need to steer clear from the pitfalls of short-termisms and take a long-term view when considering the impact of the decisions we take today. Europe and the world have been facing increasing waves of populism, brought on not least by growing disillusionment in the political class. However, we are already seeing the effects where populist propaganda has not been able to translate into viable and sustainable long-term policies. I feel it is our duty as members of parliament to work hard in order to regain the trust of the people we serve. We must also make sure that the electorate is sufficiently engaged in EU affairs to ensure that their votes in the upcoming EU elections reflect European and not local issues. Furthermore, we need to recognize that to safeguard our common future, we need to act in concert. And we can only do so by enhancing the excellent interparliamentary cooperation that already exists. I thus support strongly the proposal which is going to be put forward today in the conclusions to revise the guidelines for interparliamentary cooperation to reflect today's realities and to streamline the activities on the basis of many years of experience. In conclusion, and as a reaction to what President Fico said earlier, the Libya crisis is at our shore. My dear colleagues, my country, Malta, has only one hospital which caters for acute emergencies. As I speak here to you today, the Maltese newspapers are reporting that Mater Dei Hospital is preparing to receive the injured who will be flown into my country from Libya for treatment today. These are the challenges that face us. This is where Europe can truly show itself for the Europe it really is. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau Vize.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The next speaker is the Belgian representative, President Jacques Brochy.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. We would also like to commend you for the excellent organization of this Conference of Speakers of the European Union Parliaments. Thank you also for the hospitality and the very pleasant evening yesterday at the Leopold Museum. I'm delighted to be with you today. In our complex and heterogeneous societies, the representation on a national level is no longer sufficient. We also need a directly elected chamber, a second chamber, which can ensure the expression of the various views of a country. And therefore, since its beginnings, Belgium has always relied on bicameralism, on a two-chamber system, which is still a modern idea. And this is also going to be a discussion in the meeting of Senates in Paris. And I welcome the initiative taken by the French Senate to support the role of the Senates. This is an initiative which goes back to my colleague, Mr. Larcher. In this perspective, my assembly has a role of cement, of joining forces in our country. The Belgian Senate is, of course, an institution which has a certain age, but it is still a young institution. We have undergone fundamental reforms 5 years ago, and in Belgium, the Senate did not wait for young people to take to the roads to protest against climate change. Back in 2014, the Senators started a reflection on the challenges of climate change and on the necessary alternatives we need to find in the area of energy transition. I'm a doctor by training, and I think that environmental issues also include the dimension of public health. Among other things, our Senate has adopted a document on air quality. Senates have to use their power because this is an expression of our regions, of our municipalities. We need a concerted action between the members of the European Union. In Belgium, the Senate is a meeting place where, among other things, climate questions can be discussed in all their nuances. No country nowadays can find solutions on its own. We need to work together, and this is why I am requesting and why I'm asking for common and strong European answers. I would also like to express my support for the draft conclusions. The Belgian Senate has adopted a resolution on our obligations as regards the past and the fight against anti-Semitism and negationism. We have to follow up on this in all our European countries, just like what is done in Germany, Sweden, Bulgaria, and other countries. I particularly welcome the resolution adopted in the European Council on the 6th of December 2018. We have all witnessed a rise of anti-Semitism, and we need a joint European answer in order to be able to fight this phenomenon. Thank you for your attention.
Vielen Dank, Herr Präsident.
Thank you, President, for your remarks. The next speaker on the list is Vice President Ignazio Benito Maria La Russa from Italy.
La ringrazio, Presidente, e mi unisco ai ringraziamenti che da più parti, da tutti anzi, sono stati rivolti.
Words of thanks by those that preceded me for this important conference and the kind of hospitality. I would like to call your attention on a specific point in the conclusion, which is paragraph number 13. In the conclusion, it is pointed out that only a union which is able to deliver clear benefits over measures taken at national, regional, local levels will be able to improve a positive perception among the citizens of the European Union. I fully agree with it, and I have to say that President Schäuble's remarks were extremely important because he reminded us that there are citizens that fail to understand what the advantages are to be part of the European Union. And frankly, I reflected over this lack of support also in Italy, that maybe it's a sort of situation which is more marked than in other countries. I believe that one reason may be the fact that the European Union is perceived as being very detached and distant from the necessary measures that would be needed to handle the question of migration. I believe that it is just high time to go beyond the status of the state of first entry, which is embedded in the Dublin Convention and regulation, and actually reach a more shared kind of responsibility that should lead to a shared political and economic approach to migration that otherwise would make many Italian nationals totally disaffected with the idea of the European Union. This, in my opinion, Mr. President, is a very sensitive issue, especially now that we are going towards the summer months, during which we expect an increase in migrant flows. Leaving aside the actual tragedy of Libya that is undergoing, I know that Libya is especially difficult. It is especially complex. I know that many different attempts have been made. So to find a solution or to contribute to a solution of the crisis. But I believe that from this point of view, Italy has the right to ask that Europe does much more. I believe that the founding principles of the Dublin regulations should be reviewed, and I put forward this comment of mine to you, and hopefully looking forward to the beginning of such a path. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is the representative from Luxembourg, and I call upon the President Ferdinand Etienne. Mr. President, dear colleagues, the European Union was never so politicized as it is now. It is not a long time ago that we spoke of a political European Union, and now we are dealing and we are concerned about a European Union that is too political because there is too much polarization, including also among our countries. And this polarization in politics in Europe, from that I can draw a very simple conclusion. Yes, to a political Europe, and a Europe that is even more political, where all the members can be heard and where everybody can defend his and her interests. But no, to a Europe of centrifugal forces that runs the risk of destroying it all. Or to put it in other words, the more Europe is political, the more it also needs institutions, European institutions that are strong. And if we want to have a strong Europe, then this is a guarantee for the national strong parliaments. Let's look a little further, and let's look at the daily quarrels in history. And the history of the construction of Europe shows quite clearly that Europe, this can only be to the benefit of our countries if we strengthen our ties, and we should also take up is also faced with the problem of credibility, and its operation and its functioning is really democratic. And we, the citizens, are directly represented at the European Parliament, and our governments are represented at the Council of Ministers and at the European Council. And of course, as was said by Mr. Schäuble, and many of you have also said so, the national parliaments have a very important role to play in this setup. The European Union is not an institutional bloc that is distanced from the citizens. And there is not only just one Europe for us, as was said by Mr. Laschet this morning, and I would like to support the following. I would like to say that we are all the European Union, and the more that we focus on that and we don't talk about the institutional issues, and the existing treaties have been used, and in the future it's quite clear to me that the leaders of the European Union should not simply invest all of their energy in these national discussions, but we should regain the confidence of citizens, and for that, more than ever before, we need to focus on the common policies and should have beyond the elections and beyond Brexit obligations that require us to act, and the climate change, globalization, and the digital age, migration, and the network of our economies, etc. I think this is where we have to act. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much. And the next speaker is the representative from Greece. I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Nikolaos Voutsis.
Mr. Abe, Mr. Sobotka, thank you very much for the excellent organization of this meeting, for hosting us in your country. In light of the EU elections, this discussion is very significant. I would like to point out, first of all, on the principle of subsidiarity, that there should be no perception that leads, at the end of the day, to denying the very European integration and leads to a renationalization of policies, and in that sense it becomes an impediment. We need to redefine in a positive way the need for the principle of subsidiarity. We agree fully with the proposals to increase interparliamentary cooperation and the discussion among us at all levels. I would like to brief you that in the Greek Parliament there have been recently decisions made that have been integrated into the statutes and the practices of the Committee on European Affairs, based on which changes and amendments and reforms, the relationship between the Greek Parliament and the European Parliament becomes closer in the sense of scrutiny, persons, policies, timely discussions in view of the semesters, taking stock, holding discussions on the regulations that are being implemented in the Hellenic Parliament. So this creates an organic relationship, if you will, between the Greek Parliament and the European Parliament. Dear colleagues, many spoke of a Europe that finds itself in times of crisis or at a crossroads. It is, I would say, a historic moment because we need to define our strategy, the strategy and the policies as well, because we are witnessing that, and many mentioned this, that the lack of trust towards the EU is due to a great extent to the following. Instead of having convergence, social convergence, financial convergence, or in specific policies, we are still seeing the production of great injustices and inequalities and different speeds. And this really takes us away from the common solidary coexistence. And secondly, instead of having a constant bolstering of democracy and the architecture of the EU that will produce and will be inspired by democracy, all the more we see decisions of what is called the hard core of the Union, so that we don't find ourselves before impasses and dead ends, excuse me. All the more important, we need to seek, all of us together, to seek the European identity based on the values of peace, humanism, rule of law, democracy, instead of the copious search for a national identity that enhances differences, and we see nationalist tendencies on the rise. Fourth, instead of understanding Europe internationally as just something we follow up on, just somebody we watch while globalization is taking place, and all that was already mentioned, going back to trade wars and to actual wars that are being waged in our region, clearly we need to look, all of us together, for a new international global role to enhance international institutions that enhance peace, and also to take stock of the situation of globalization right now so that Europe really will be able to play its historic role. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And now I would like to give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom, Rosie Winterton.
Mr. President, thank you for hosting this excellent conference, for your generous hospitality, especially last night at the wonderful Leopold Museum. Colleagues, the background paper for this session refers to the impact of Brexit on the European elections. And at this point, it is unclear whether the UK will or will not take part in those elections. I know how frustrating this is for EU member states, for all of you, and I hope that in that context you will let me make some remarks about Brexit. I think all of us here know that Brexit is taking up a lot of time and energy, but my message here today is to ask for your understanding of the very difficult discussions that the British Parliament is struggling with as a result of trying to translate the verdict of the 2016 referendum into an agreement with our European friends, all of you here, so that we can get a smooth transition which protects jobs and industry throughout the European Union and continues our commitments to environmental protection, to cooperation on security issues, and on so many other areas in which we have a mutual interest. And all of the keynote speakers and other speakers as well spoke of the role of national parliaments in bringing the people closer to Europe. And I'm sure colleagues will appreciate, perhaps more than others, that the role of the speaker, and for that matter the deputy speakers, has become quite pivotal in trying to find a way through with regard to Brexit, so that the UK Parliament is able to express its own view on the ongoing relationship with EU member states. And because there are clearly conflicting views, not just across the UK Parliament, but also, frankly, within political parties, it is perhaps not surprising that it is taking time. And a badly thought out decision could lead to chaos for all of us. So I hope, friends, you will bear that in mind in understanding our situation. On the upside, however, there is a renewed interest in parliamentary debates. Never in my 22 years as a Member of Parliament has one of my constituents ever said to me, "I'm addicted to watching Parliament on the television." They're fascinated by the role of the Speaker. So if this interest spreads to other countries, you must all be prepared for international movie star status. And I gather it's already happening in Sweden to Speaker Norlén. So the UK is, as it should be, reflecting the views of the different views of the people of the UK. But we have voted twice against leaving the EU without a deal. And following the enactment of legislation last night, Parliament will vote tonight on a motion to require the government to request from the European Council an extension to the Article 50 deadline. Talks are continuing as we meet here between the opposition and the government. So let us see what transpires. In closing, Mr. President, I want to reiterate that the UK Parliament and all the political parties within it wish to remain friends and colleagues with our European partners. And forums like this are a vital way of achieving that. So thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau Vizepräsidentin.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. Thank you very much, all of you, for your contributions. And thank you also for your praise concerning our organization. And together with my colleague, Mr. Sobotka, I will pass on your congratulations to those who worked behind the background to make this an excellent and successful conference. And I would like to give back the floor to our speakers, 4 minutes each. And President Schreiber, you're the first one. Thank you very much, Mr. President. The last speaker in this debate, I don't know how you arranged for that, that this was the UK representative. And since this was the case, I would like to say one thing. I would advise all the other members of the European Union that we should use all of our patience and show all of our patience, because at the end of the day, whatever will happen, it should not be an issue that eventually will separate and divide Europe, so that people will not say, if we had been generous, we would have avoided a hard Brexit or whatever. And therefore, we wish you all success in your efforts. However, I would like to add the following comment. I can quite understand that the House of Commons is currently attracting a lot of public attention. I don't know whether it will really strengthen respect for parliamentarism if we get the impression that in every issue you will get a negative answer, but you will never get a positive answer, and you will never get a majority for a positive answer. And this is our European problem. Our colleague from Cyprus said, if we leave the floor, if we do not want to leave so much floor to the demagogues, to the populists, then we must be able to reach decisions. And that's requires efficiency. And that's what we have to bear in mind time and again, all the time when we talk about the lack of trust of citizens in Europe and it's the fact that it takes such a long time for us to take decisions. That's a major issue. And therefore, we have to think about how we can overcome that. Let me pick up what was said by President Laschet. We shouldn't have institutional debates. It's not the time for that. But we should think what decisions need to be taken now on migration policy, in foreign and defense policy, in economic policy, and how can we bring these decisions about? And then let's act as pragmatically as possible and as efficient as possible, because that's what it's all about if we want to show that Europe can solve problems better. And I think that's what we need if we want to have more support. Let me also add our Hungarian colleague said that Europe consists of very strong national states, but there are certain issues that even the strongest national state can no longer solve in Europe. We talked about the Western Balkan yesterday. Unless we have a perspective that the Western Balkan will become part of Europe, stability in the Western Balkan will not be reassured. And the strongest Hungary will not be in a position to do so. For that, you need a strong European Union. Libya is another issue. Mr. Fico spoke about that. We have no common position concerning Libya, but the consequences, if that goes wrong, is something that we will have to bear together here in Europe. And this is why we must act quickly and have to be better in all of these issues. And one last comment. The cooperation of national parliaments is very important. We need to understand each other better. And in our national discussions, and our public discussions, we always include the views of others. Otherwise, we will never have common European decisions. But cooperation and the role of national parliaments should not lead to a situation where the efficiency of European decisions becomes even more complicated. Here we need to know that the role of national parliaments in the European decision-making process needs to be limited. Otherwise, we will only discuss. We will discuss a lot, but we will never get any decisions, and ultimately this will weaken Europe. And therefore, I think it is important that we move very delicately on this reply, and this should be our support, and this should guide us so that our decisions are better understood by citizens in Europe, because it's only then that we can cope with the big challenges of our times, the challenges for Europe and the world. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And now, Focus Knoll, you have the floor.
It was very interesting to hear the contributions of many colleagues. It was also very interesting and I think very necessary to hear the voice of the House of Commons here today. Thank you for that. And, well, I think you have the support of many that we want to have a good deal in this whole, as I called it, opera, but it's a serious question. One thing stands out, the awareness that we politicians discuss, confer, and decide upon is for the benefit of our citizens. A stable, prosperous, and peaceful future of our citizens is in essence the purpose of the European Union. As politicians, whether we are national or European politicians, we must not forget this. At the same time, and I want to stress this, as I perceive that is still of the utmost importance, all member states must share the same values, not only at the moment of becoming a member of the EU, but as a dedication, a mandate when a member. Forging these fundamental values to a country's own liking can easily undermine the concept of the Union and therefore make it weaker. I therefore hope that our discussions and direct dialogue at interparliamentary conferences are an incentive to all of us to uphold the fundamental values of the EU for the benefit of our citizens. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau Präsidentin.
Thank you very much. Senator Bizet, you have the floor.
Merci.
Thank you very much. On behalf of President Larcher, who has had to leave us already, unfortunately, let me say that I subscribe to what President Schäuble just said. If we look at the compromise text which has been handed out, the Bundestag has suggested an amendment as regards to Brexit, and it's quite obvious that the European Union will have to take a decision. European Union means finding compromises, taking time to find decisions. But the world is changing. The world hasn't come to a halt, and therefore the Union itself needs to be moving again. It cannot afford to be blocked by Brexit. Even though we do understand the words of our British colleague, I would have wished that we could have changed the amendment submitted by the Bundestag, where it says the speakers expressed their hope that a negotiated solution will be found. I would have added, in order to end the current uncertainty and to allow for Europe to take up the challenges which it faces. I see that President Schäuble seems to indicate his consent to this additional amendment.
Vielen Dank, Herr Senator. Herr Präsident.
Thank you, Senator. President Kuczynski has the floor.
Bardzo dziękuję, panie przewodniczący. Proszę państwa, cóż tutaj dodać?
Thank you very much, Chair. What else could I add? We actually agree with most of the amendments and comments made. In my view, we can say that we see very clearly the efforts made by representatives of our countries that have been taken in the recent years are aimed at finding a solution to put an order to the cooperation within the EU without closing the EU to other states. We want to forge solutions related to matters of vital importance. Personally, I would see two areas of importance. On the one hand, in the broadly understood set of values, we should find a recipe to solve fundamental issues for the EU of economic and institutional nature, with the system of values that we often refer to as an axiological area of spirituality. In other words, every single deed of ours related to social culture, identity, etc., etc. Indeed, that is a challenge, but I understand that we all have a positive attitude towards finding a solution to that. Second of all, I see a need to put an order to the terms that we're using, to set our terminology straight and to define the competences of the institutions as vested in the treaties. That's my perspective of looking at the subsidiarity principle. In my opinion, strengthening the role of national parliaments and including them in matters related to lawmaking in the EU, as well as impacting the development of the EU in order to strengthen it so that the EU becomes a key player on the global arena in global politics. This all is a dire need that I express and that I fully support. I'm very much aware that it won't be easy to find a solution to that. It won't come to us easily, but I think it's one of the fundamental matters ahead of us. Otherwise, we may still be facing such elements as increasing resentment in some member states of certain political forces towards the EU, as well as decreasing interest in the EU. I hope that won't happen. I hope that the European Parliament elections and the turnout will give us a clear sign. Thank you very much. I wish all the best to all of you and see you during the next conference. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Herr Präsident.
Thank you, President. Thank you to all of the speakers, dear colleagues. Thank you for your active contribution to today's debate on this very important topic.